Come closer. Not because it's safer here, it isn't, but because this one is worth hearing properly. Picture a mountain village on the 5th night of December, the air gone knife-thin with cold, and somewhere past the tree line, the sound of chains dragging over stone. In the high valleys of the Alps, in the villages of Austria and Bavaria and the quiet border towns between them, the 5th of December belonged to a saint. Nicholas came on that night, as he had for generations, robed in white, his beard silvered with the cold he did not seem to feel. He carried small gifts, fruit, nuts, coins wrapped in paper, for the children who had been good. Families left their doors unlatched for him. Children were told to wait quietly, to be patient, because the saint rewarded those who could sit still in the dark and trust that morning would come. But Nicholas did not walk these roads alone. That was the part the old grandmothers were careful to mention, usually late, usually by firelight, usually just as a child's eyes were beginning to close. He came first. He always came first. But something followed a few steps behind him, keeping to the deeper shadow past the doorframe, waiting its turn to be let in. The saint's bell was soft, the other bell was not, and in the houses that heard both that night, no one ever quite finished exhaling until the second set of footsteps had passed the gate. He is described in the surviving folklore and in illustrations that stretch back over a century as something that should not stand upright and yet does, horned like a goat, furred black to the shoulder, a face that borrows features from a man the way a mask borrows a face, close enough to unsettle, wrong enough to be certain it was never meant to pass as one. Postcards from the early 1900s already show him complete, fully formed, grinning beside Nicholas as though the two had always traveled together and always would. The saint in these old prints does not look afraid. That, more than anything, was what troubled the children who saw them. If the saint was not afraid of him, what did that mean about what he was allowed to do? He carries chains, he carries bells tied at wrist and ankle, so that his approach announces itself, a slow metallic rattle rolling down through the village streets before the shape attached to it ever comes into view. Villagers said you always heard Krampus before you saw him, which was, they admitted, the worst part. A sound gives the mind time to build its own picture, and the mind left alone in the dark with a rattle of chain drawing closer tends to build something far worse than the truth. Whether that was mercy or cruelty, no one in those villages ever quite agreed. Where the saint gave, Krampus was said to collect. The old tellings are specific about who he came for, who had been cruel to younger siblings, who had shirked chores and broken promises and let their tempers run past where kindness should have stopped him. Nicholas rewarded virtue. Krampus, the stories insisted, remembered everything else. The accounts describe him working door to door on the same night as the saint, the two of them moving through the village in a kind of terrible tandem, one blessing a threshold, the other lingering just past it, waiting to see which houses had earned only him. He is said to have lashed his chains against door frames to announce himself properly, to have rung his bells hard enough to rattle the windows of houses where a child was still awake and listening. The birch switch bundled at his hip was, in the gentlest versions of the story, the whole of the punishment, a swat across the legs, a fright to remember. But the oldest tellings passed mother to daughter in the kind of voice reserved for warnings meant to actually be heeded, suggested the switch was only where Krampus started. What he did after, in the houses that had truly failed him, depended entirely on which grandmother was telling it. And every family in the valley seemed to agree on exactly one thing. Nobody wanted to find out which version was closest to true. You know this feeling already, even if you've never stood in an Alpine doorway in December. It's the same one that stops you from turning around in an empty room. The same one that makes you listen harder rather than look. Krampus was built for that instinct. A sound in chains before a shape in the dark. I only mention it so you'll recognize it later, when it's your turn to hear the bells. Folklorists have long read the two figures as a single reckoning wearing two faces, mercy arriving in the same knock as consequence, so that no family could receive one without also risking the other. It is a structure far older than the saint himself. Alpine communities held midwinter customs long before Christianity reached these valleys, figures tied to the turning of the year, to the dark half of the season demanding its due before the light was allowed to return. Whether Krampus descends directly from those older spirits is folklore, not settled record. The honest historians will tell you the line is suggested, not proven. But the shape of the custom, reward and dread walking the same road together, is far too old and far too consistent across too many separate villages to have been invented once in one place by design. The church noticed him, eventually, and did not care for what it saw. A demon walking beside a saint was, to certain clergy across the centuries, an arrangement too uncomfortable to permit. There were attempts to suppress the custom, official discouragement, sermons against it, periods where the tradition was pushed underground and told only in private, in kitchens, after the children had supposedly gone to bed. It never quite worked. The villages held on to him anyway, quietly, stubbornly, the way mountain communities hold on to anything the lowlands try to take from them. Something about the shape of Krampus refused to stay buried, no matter how many times the authorities tried to put him there. What survived instead, openly, is the Krampus Lauf, the Krampus Run. Young men in the Alpine towns began donning carved wooden masks, some passed down for generations, heavy furs sewn thick against the winter cold, and became the thing itself for one night a year. These processions were loud by design, chaotic by design, bells crashing against the stone streets, switches swung at onlookers who had, in most cases, come specifically to be frightened. The runs persisted across Austria and South Tyrol, handed down through families as much through fear as through festivity, a tradition kept alive not despite the dread it produced, but because of it. And those who have stood in the crowd at a Krampuslauf, close enough to feel the heat of the torches and the cold at their backs in equal measure, tend to describe one particular moment the same way, regardless of which village they were standing in. It is the moment one of the masks stops moving through the crowd at random and turns, deliberately, to look directly at them. Ask anyone who has felt that what it did to the space behind their ribs. The wearers themselves have spoken of something the folklore seems almost to anticipate, that the mask, once it settles over the face, feels less performed than inhabited. Older villagers passed the costume down alongside a set of warnings that sat strangely beside a children's tradition. Don't wear the mask too long. Don't wear it alone. Small cautions, easy to dismiss in daylight, harder to dismiss at midnight with the fur heavy on your shoulders and the bells still ringing from your last step. Whether this is superstition or something the tradition genuinely believes, the caution persisted for generations regardless. A suggestion that Krampus is not merely retold each December, but briefly, ritually, let back into the world. And every December the 5th, without fail, the villages let him in again. The figure has since traveled far past those original valleys, absorbed into wider Christmas iconography, printed on cards, sold as costume, turned into spectacle far from the cold roads where he began. But his roots remain specific, alpine, regional, bound to that particular pairing of reward and punishment that the saint alone could never provide. What is documented, carefully and without embellishment, is the folklore's long life. The illustrations stretching back over a century, the processions that still fill Austrian streets every winter, the customs practiced openly and photographed and written about by historians who make no claim beyond what the record actually shows. What remains legend, what has never been and will never be documented, is any literal account of where Krampus truly came from, or what he truly is beneath the fur and the mask and the bells. The chains survive because the story insists on being told exactly as it has always been told, unchanged, on the coldest night of the year, in villages that have never once considered simply letting it go. And somewhere in the Alps, tonight, someone is standing very still in a doorway, listening for bells they hope very sincerely not to hear. So when the bells start early some December night, and the cold seems to carry a weight it shouldn't, don't assume it's only wind. Some companions were never meant to be left behind. Some stories survive because they're entertaining. Others survive because they're true enough to matter. You decide which this was. I've told this one before. I'll tell it again, after you've gone.